Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to review a book I've been putting off for a little while. And before I get into my shameless self-promotion, I'm going to mention a few things. One, this is probably going to have very little editing because this is going to be quite the big review. And before I get into my shameless self-promotion, I also want to read you the beginnings of two reviews to really set the mood for this book. First, we're going to read the beginning of a 1-star review. After reading about 100 pages of this book, it came to the decision-making time. Should I hang myself and end my misery or not? Lucky for you, I simply put the book down and stepped away. No, really, lucky for you. Otherwise, you would have had to read a much longer review that broke down in amazing detail how messed up this book was. Next, we have a 5-star review. I started Gardens of the Moon off on a recommendation from some friends a few years back, and ordered, I believe, the first 3 books all at once. I decided to jump in whole hog and get into the world that everyone else had gotten into. Well, I started reading Gardens of the Moon and sheesh. I thought I'd thrown that money down the drain. I had a hell of a time getting into it, but pressed on. This is a dense novel with dozens of characters, a confusing plot, terms I didn't understand, and a shaky sense of that something is going on if only I could figure out what. In short, starting Gardens of the Moon is a bit like being thrown into the deep end when you barely know how to swim. Again, I will remind you, this is a 5-star review. And with that, we're going to get into my shameless self-promotion and the beginnings of my shameless review of Gardens of the Moon. So for my shameless self-promotion, I'm just going to promote my own work. If you'd like to read and review my own work, I shall include a link down in the description. I often do reviews like this and try to leave reviews because I feel they are the lifeblood of any independent author, and I would ask that my listeners also take the time to review the books they read. It really helps us authors out, and we greatly appreciate it more than you can understand. Now, let's begin with a recap of the timeline. Then we'll go into my pre-thoughts, what I like, what I didn't like, and my actual thoughts on the book. And I'm going to do my best at the beginning of the timeline because this is a very dense book. So our story begins with 2 different young people, teenagers mostly, on very different paths. We have Perrin, a noble's son, who's witnessing the sack of the poor quarter of a city, where they're killing off all of the mages, I believe. And he must be about 12 or 13 years old as he's watching this. And a veteran approaches him, and they have a conversation where Perrin tells this gentleman that he really wants to be a soldier, and the soldier tries his best to talk him out of it, but Perrin's best response to this is, the world doesn't need another wine cellar. It's shortly after this that we find out the Emperor of Malazan has been assassinated, and a new empress has risen to take his place. We know this because she shows up to talk to the veteran with Perrin standing there, and Perrin gets a good look at this very plain-faced empress. We then skip a little bit of time to a young girl who is retrieving twine for her father so they can make fishing nets. She is accosted on the way by a wax witch, who's a kind of low-level mage with the power of prophecy. Some soldiers come by and some words are exchanged and they basically beat the old woman to death and leave because they're apparently such nice people. This is where the young girl meets a man by the name of Cotillion. And Cotillion is the rope of Shadowthrone, who is the god of assassins. And upon discovering his name, because Cotillion's companion says it, Cotillion decides that this young girl no longer gets to leave, and that he is going to use her and choose a new name for her. This is the end of the prologue. We move on a few years later to Perrin, who is basically at the site of a massive slaughter. An entire fishing village and regiment and the army were basically torn to pieces by an undetectable enemy. And when I say torn to pieces, I mean they are trudging through ankle-deep gore. Just, it's not even identifiable people anymore. It's red chunky soup scattered across the surface. And he's not alone. All the soldiers are trying to track through, trying to figure out what's going on here. And this is when Adjunct Lon, who is one of the direct subordinates of the Empress, shows up. Adjunct Lon is a mage killer. She specializes in killing mages of all sorts who are not either sanctioned by the Malazan Empress or in the army. She takes a liking to Perrin and recruits him from his reluctant captain. And she runs him through the gamut of asking him questions about how naive he is and blah, blah, blah. It's a very long conversation. I'm not going to recant it here. Basically, she takes a liking to him and steals him away. And his captain is a bit resentful, thinking he's going to get some nice cushy job. Unfortunate for Perrin, this is not quite the case. We then skip over to the aftermath of a battle where we meet Tattersail, who is one of the premier mages of the Malazan military. They're at the end of the battle, and she's talking with a colleague who has been recently bifurcated, losing the bottom half of his body, as he's laying on another pile of bodies, bleeding out and laughing. Yes, the man who's bleeding out is laughing. This man is named Hairlock. Tattersail then goes into memories of the battle they went through, where they fought against the Lord of Moonspawn, who is a creature who's kind of like a dark elf, but not really. They're called the Tister Andy. The fight went south real quick. Fire shooting everywhere, demons coming out, killing almost the entire mage battalion, and leading us to where we are now. Tattersail is almost in tears, because this is a recurring theme with her, over this person she didn't much care for, but the entire battalion's dead, so maybe he's getting some sympathy from that. When the Bridge Burners appear. Now, the Bridge Burners they were the exemplary soldiers under the old Emperor, but they're still under the current Empress. They haven't been purged like so many others. It's a long, complicated thing that you'll figure out throughout the rest of the book. Well, one of the Bridge Burners, a mage by the name of Quickben, immediately comes over to Hairlock and starts to perform some complicated magic, which ends up transferring his soul into the body of a puppet. Yes, now we have a small mage-possessed puppet, and I like this character. I'm going to say that right now. I really like the crazy little puppet Hairlock, because Hairlock wasn't much of a person alive, and now that he's a puppet, he's a demented little murder machine. Tattersail takes Hairlock back to her tent, where she starts doing a tarot reading with this world's version of the tarot cards called the Deck of Dragons, but unlike real tarot cards, these actually work and are a little bit creepy. This is one of the first places we hear about the spinning coin of Opon, who is the god of luck. It's during this, in a conversation with Hairlock, that Tattersail realizes they were betrayed during the battle by High Mage Tashrin, who basically unleashed demons and fire on his own people. We skip back again to Perrin's reassignment, as he has now been reassigned to lead the Bridge Burners. He has to fly there on the back of a Moranth dragonfly, which is this giant dragonfly creature. The Moranth are a whole thing. I'm not going to get into them. It explains a little bit about them, but not too much. Maybe that's explained a bit more in other books, but again, this story is really, really dense. When Perrin arrives, he confronts the officer corps of his new battalion, or whatever size regiment it was. I'm sorry, I got lost. And he brings up the fact that many of the former officers have been stabbed to death, betrayed, basically left dead because of basically who the Bridge Burners are. After making his point fairly clear about who he is and where he stands, and it looks like relative peace has been achieved between him and the Bridge Burners, he proceeds to walk down a dark alley where he is immediately stabbed to death by a recruit of the Bridge Burners, and left for dead. Really didn't take very long now, did it? I wonder why they have such trouble with this particular unit. Anyway, we join Perrin again outside of Hood's Gate. Hood being the god of death in this world, where he runs across a few very peculiar individuals. He runs upon the twin god Opon, who's the god of luck. He runs upon the servant of Hood, who is trying to usher him through the gate. And he runs into the hounds of Shadowthrone, who are the loyal hunting hounds of the assassin god. And after some quick exchange, the twin god Opon decides to intervene and return Perrin to life. Because apparently Opon decides they're going to participate in some shenanigans with this mortal. Shadowthrone is initially not happy about this, but Perrin, being the quick-thinking individual that he is, remembers that one thing gods hate more than anything else is uncertainty, and tells Shadowthrone that he should let him go because now he knows what Opon's tool is, whereas if he were to kill him now and force him through Hood's Gate, he would have no clue who the next one was, which is apparently enough for him to convince them. And so Shadowthrone allows him to return to life, where they immediately try to bring him into an inn and heal him, because the bridge burners are astounded that this man took several mortal wounds and isn't dead. And now we are off to Darujhistan. And we meet my actual favorite character, Cropper, in one of his dreams. Cropper is a big fat, retired master thief whose dreams have the gift of prophecy. And I believe this is one of the most fun parts of the book, as he's basically wandering through the dreamland he has created, full of ripe grapes and happy people and odd things to see, just mildly commenting on his, "Oh, isn't that weird? This is a strange thing. I can't believe where this has come." And he always talks about himself in the third person. One point in his dream, he's going up a very slight hill towards an inn, and he's complaining about the pain in his feet and how weary he is. And I'm going to do my best impression of him here. He's like, "Oh, Cropper's poor feet, they are so sore, they need anointed bandages, and his throat is so parched he needs beer and fresh meat. And then only after this will he have a word with such a disrespectful innkeeper who would put his inn at the top of a hill." He's a very funny character. I like him a lot because he comes across as an idiot while simultaneously coming across as there being something a bit more to him. We cut from his dream to Cropper's apprentice, Crocus, who is in the process of robbing a noble's daughter, basically stealing all of her stuff. She's this very attractive noble. Everybody wants to get with her, and he's doing his best just to clean the room out. And he gets a wild-haired to go take a look at the sleeping girl on the bed, and he gets a shot of her topless, which unnerves the boy to some degree, and not because he hasn't seen naked women before. He comes off the streets, he's been in brothels, he knows what women look like, but he's awestruck by her beauty and blah blah blah. And he gets so distracted in his leaving that he doesn't really notice what's going on around him. And the god Opon drops, I guess what you'd call a lucky coin, which he proceeds to drop down and grab, at which point a crossbow bolt literally splits the hair on the top of his head, like it misses him by a mere inch. And it turns out that he came out of that room just in time to be caught up in the middle of an assassin's war. Through several lucky strokes, he somehow manages to get home while several paid professional killers fail to do the very job they are professionals for. And we're going to stop the recap there, because we've been doing this for over 10 minutes, and we're at about the 10% mark of the book. When I said this is a long, dense book, I wasn't lying. So let's move on to my pre-thoughts. This story is massive, and I don't mean just in page number and number of words per page. This story is huge. Even just in the recap I went through, I might have missed about half the content because I'm trying to keep this review under an hour. It's a massive book full of lots of stuff and cultures and random things that are going on. I have read this book twice, and I am still picking up new stuff as I go through it again. Even the number of characters who have a name and have a purpose in the story is staggering. And to do a full review of this would take 3 or 4 hours. And I'm not editing 3 or 4 hours for you guys. I'm sorry. So let's get into the things that I liked. The magic system in this book is fan-freaking-tastic. I love it. It's deep and strange, but also fairly vague. It's based on warrens, which are these kind of holes in reality that sometimes lead to gods and sometimes don't. Basically, when you're being trained to be a mage, you open the warren and whatever comes out is yours to control. That is literally how the book says it. And they'll spend several decades, if not centuries, mastering this. In fact, magic allows people to extend their lives, to fix people, to summon demons, basically set the world on fire. The things that it can do are limitless, and not just in large scale, but in small scale. Almost every single person in this world knows how to do magic in some way, but it's low level. Apparently you're not actually a mage unless you can do some of the major stuff, but almost every character in this story does magic in some way, whether it's just making light or picking something up from a distance. Magic is ever present in this world. It is amazingly commonplace, but mages apparently are those who have either had formal training or simply taken it a step farther. The next thing I like, and I want to emphasize when I say that it is an impressive thing, because I never mention this with any other book, the prose. This guy writes fantastically. This book is both, the prose are both concise but very detail rich. After spending so much time reading independent authors, people who are getting their start, or people who frankly don't care, it's refreshing to see something written so well. It can be a bit of a problem though, because at some points, and I would say some points, at most points, it can be a bit too much. It's like having a German chocolate cake that's both tiered and full of rich sugary fruits and liquors and all that. It's just a bit too dense and rich, and this is not going to be the last time I compare this book to food. But I want to say, if you're going to write fantasy, this is probably a must-read book. Not just for the things that he does, but for the way that he writes. It's not quite purple prose, but he doesn't skimp on the fantasy element of the writing. Something to make it feel whimsical at times, or magical at other times, or when he's talking about somebody who's kind of dopey, makes you laugh about it. He does a fantastic job with them, and I'm going to gush on that this time and probably this time only, because I believe that a story is more important than the prose, so long as the prose are decent. Next, let's talk about the gods, because this is not a world that has atheists in it, because the gods are an active part of people's lives, and I don't mean by praying to them. The gods seem to be this outside force that meddles in everybody's lives. Nobody wants to be the focus of a god, because the gods are basically concocting all these schemes, ruining people's lives, and they'll use you for just as long as they need to before dumping you off, and you have no friends anymore, no family anymore, and everybody hates you. So you can imagine why nobody really likes the gods. It's also not entirely clear how all of them work. They have their own realms, which different warrens dip into, and they have their own cults, kind of, but they're more like guilds. They're extremely powerful, but they're also killable. They're not all powerful. It's really difficult to go into too much detail about the gods, because so little is revealed about them. It makes them fun and interesting, but it also makes them kind of a force for chaos. Also, they have avatars in a sense. They can act through a person, but they also, some of them have kind of a second in command that can possess people and act on behalf of the god. It's really difficult, and it might be specific to the gods themselves. It can be like Shadow Throne, the god of assassins, has his 7 hounds, which he'll send after interlopers, people who are trying to meddle with his affairs, or just simply because he doesn't like you. But he also has a being called the Rope, and the rope possesses people to act on behalf of Shadow Throne more directly, and then he can act through his servants. The gods seem to have these big followings, and he's not alone, but he's one of the few that we're covered in more detail. Aside from Opan, the god of luck, who is basically just a mystery, it's a male and a female, and whenever they act through somebody, it seems to basically leave that person's life in tatters. So it does make them interesting both as antagonist and aid, but there's other gods as well, which are a bit more obtuse. There's a little bit about time travel, which is a bit confusing. There's a lot to the gods, and let's move into what the gods work with, and that's the world. This world is deep. It is deep, deep, deep. There are cultures we just touch on, and even when you touch on them, you find out so much about their culture and who they are and how they work and their power hierarchies and why they're helping this group and why they're opposing that group who attacked them in the past. The world is just massively deep, and at some point it just becomes background noise because there's just so much of it. It's not like he's spieling their entire history the moment they introduce them, but they're referenced quite often, and it's probably because they're part of the world, or they fought in a war, or just any number of things which are important to the world history but are kind of hard to follow when you're thrown into this book on the deep end. And as histories are important, languages are also important. Every region speaks its own language. The Darujistani speak Daru, and the Malazans speak their own language. And there's a few other languages here and there scattered about that people need to learn to speak. Some of them are truly weird. And we'll get into the people who live in this, the characters. The one saving grace that I think the author did in this series was give the characters easy to remember names. Because I'm going to be frank with you, had he followed some common naming conventions and made them just a random bunch of syllables and sounds with apostrophes between them, I would not have been able to follow this book. It would have got a 1 star. It would have been impossible to even get into this. They're kind of like little anchors that help pull you through the story, and it's going to be a slog to get through the story the first time. With the different named characters, they all feel different. They all have different things about them. They're mostly compelling and interesting. Some of them are a little bland. Some of them don't get as much attention as they probably deserve. But for the most part, you can tell them apart. When one speaks, you can tell who they are. It can be challenging in the first half of the book to really tell them apart because even in the first half of the book, the author isn't entirely clear on who is who. But once you finally figure that out, it's smooth sailing from there. Let's get into my dislikes. First of all, time. This author does not seem to have a good relationship with time. By the end of the book, something being old feels meaningless. If you're 200 years old, oh, whatever. 20,000 years and 100,000 years ain't that uncommon. There reaches a point where the scale is just too enormous to appreciate. My city's 2,000 years old. Oh, well, that's unfortunate because we've got an undead warrior over here who's been waiting for 100,000 years for someone to be born in this particular region. He was there for the last 5 wars and civilizations that lived in this area. It gets a bit absurd. And there's a subplot with one of the characters dying, having their soul combined with something else. And it happens in the dream of a different character, but it's about 100,000 years in the past, but they're not going to be reborn until recently. It makes sense, but it's too much. It's just too, that's just too much. It's a bit too odd. Next, the world is too deep. And that's going to sound weird, but there's no smooth introduction into Malazan. You hit the ground running as hard as possible. It's like you were in the air. They told you to start sprinting as hard as you could and just tossed you out 20,000 feet up, hoping you'll survive by the time you hit the ground. It is a dense read. I got through it on my first go, but you can read the reviews on the Amazon page and you can tell there are quite a few people who did not. And that's not just the 1 stars. Many of the 5-star reviews say they got halfway through, had to put it down and come back and read it later. And I'd say that's a good third of the 5-star reviews, and this thing has 15,000 5-star reviews. So, that'll let you know you are not alone if you start this book and get lost. Though I will say it is worth getting to the end. It is a good story. It's just really, really difficult to get through at times. And this goes back to the prose. Often there's just too much stuff at one time. Just too much packed into an area. There's no introduction really to anything. The beginning of the book just throws you into a town, doesn't tell you its name, but starts mentioning stuff about it, and it's confusing. You're not sure what it's referencing. A more gentle introduction to this book probably would have done it wonders, but it's entirely possible it would have taken away from the story. And one of the problems with this being too dense is there are several chapters I had to go through and listen to a second time on my first read through this book. Just because I was lost. I had a moment where I might have burped or looked away or got lost, missed an important sentence, and had to listen to the whole chapter again just to figure out what was going on. And there are several people who say the other books are much better. This is the weakest entry in the series. And from what I understand, that is the case, but it is still a monstrous introduction to the series. Just, it's a bit too much. So let's get into my thoughts. First of all, I'm not going to quibble about it. This is peak high fantasy. It's got a rich world, rich magics, full of all sorts of different and interesting races and histories and language. If you like that stuff, you are absolutely going to love everything in the Malazan series, provided you can get through the extremely high barrier to entry. There's lots of mystery, obscure powers, the power structure has changed, relationship between humans and gods have changed. It's just, in some of the stuff in this world is insane. I mentioned earlier in the timeline about the war between Malazan and Moonspawn. To let you know what Moonspawn is, it's a moon. It's a moon that hovers about 200 feet off the planet and is home to this group of dark elf-like creatures called the Tister Andi, which basically live in shadows, who are led by the Lord of Moonspawn, who has a knife that literally sends people into a dimension where they are enslaved to pull a giant cart for all eternity. This world is wild. But also, this series is really daunting. First of all, the first book, because I went through the audiobook because I'm busy and I don't have time to sit down and read a 1,000+ page book during December and January and November, which is when I started this. But the first book is 24 hours long on the audiobook alone, and it's not something you can speed up. The narrator is fantastic. He does a wonderful job on this, and I hope they paid him well, because he deserved it. But it's 24 hours of tightly packed, dense information. There are several times I had to stop just to catch my breath and process what I had listened to over the past 2 hours. It's not an easy read. But on top of that, there are 10 books in the main series and 11+ supplemental books. I remembered the exact number months ago, but after reading through this book twice, I honestly don't think I'm going to touch those 11+ supplements. I would have to dedicate basically a year of my life to getting through this series and making a series of reviews on it. And while I found it interesting, I'm not sure I want to do that. This is fantasy, yes, but it is dark fantasy. And when I mean dark, I mean if this was dark chocolate, it would be 99% cacao. It would almost be powder. That's what we're talking about here. And again, this is not a light series. You're not going to just casually start this. It's long, and there are parts that are just too difficult sometimes to get through in one pass. I took notes on this series, and it almost didn't help. I had to listen to it a second time. Granted, I got a lot from the second time, like how Darujhistan uses gas lights that are on these old copper pipes that they put throughout the city. making the whole city glow blue at night. And that's a whole atmospheric change from how I felt about it the first time I read the book. I don't know how I missed it, but it's just because it's so dense. So to end my comparisons on food, to let you know just how much is here, imagine you eat a huge Thanksgiving dinner full of delicious food, and right after you're done and sitting there with a swollen gut, barely able to move, you decide you're going to go to an all-you-can-eat buffet and top that off with a night of hard drinking. It's not something you want to do in one sitting. Even if you decide to tackle this book, trying to do it all in one go is just probably not something you want to try. That being said, I might pick up the next book. I have no idea. It's taken 3 months to get through this book twice. I put a lot of other stuff on hold because I felt it was important to get through because it is an interesting story. There's a lot going on here. The problem is you have to be able to finish it to appreciate it. And the only people I could honestly recommend this to would be hardcore fantasy nerds. And I mean the hardest of hardcore fantasy nerds. The type of people who have miniatures and learn Elvish for the D&D table, or someone who would have a Klingon to English dictionary. Not somebody who's lightly going to enter. If you liked Harry Potter, you're probably not going to like this if that was the light kind of stuff you liked. Now, I'm also a big fan of the Game of Thrones books, The Song of Ice and Fire. And while this book has a lot of similarities, it is a much harder read. Game of Thrones takes about 100 pages to really get into. Malazan takes the whole first book. You have to get through that whole thing. Most people say they can get to a little past the halfway point, but trust me, if you're going to attempt this and you want to give it an honest review, you have to read the whole thing, and that is a daunting prospect. And with that, I will wish you all good luck. Thank you for listening to my review. If you have any books that you would like to hear my take on, please leave them in the description. I do tend to favor indie authors over conventionally published, but I will read whatever I find interesting or whatever captures my fancy. If you would like to read, review, or criticize my own works, I will include a link in the description. Also, please keep the comments civil in the comments section. Also, if you enjoy what I do, please consider giving this video a like, sharing my work, or subscribing to my channel. Thank you.